with a slightly new approach to helping everyone troubleshoot their expression maps, because this is really about some UI sort of interface features within Dorico, particularly the key editor that I think goes, well, it's very helpful, but I think it goes under the radar. It has been brought up in the forums. I know that probably many people have encountered this tool, but I thought it was going to be very helpful to demonstrate how I use it. I've been dealing particularly lately with a few students who they're trying to trace back what the problem is, and quite often, like, you know, with an expression map not loading, right, or a percussion map not loading, but here we're talking about expression maps. And quite often the challenge is that somebody might have, if you've ever set up a crescendo, for example, maybe your library like Berlin, the Berlin Orchestra have these sampled crescendos, and you go into your playback or playing techniques area, and you see you've got crescendos 1 second, crescendo 2 seconds, you've got crash, you know, crescendo, you've got all these different things. And so it seems natural and completely intuitive to a Dorico user that they would look at their score, they'd see crash or maybe a hairpin or one of these sorts of indicators, and they assume that that's going to trigger their crescendo even when it's added into their expression map. Like, they look in their expression map, but maybe crescendo 1 second is in their expression map, and the playing technique that they've actually put in their score is not precisely and exactly the same crescendo playing technique. So it can be difficult to figure that out intuitively, because you're looking at your score and everything seems to be in order. You're looking at your expression map, everything seems to be in order. This tool is how I trace down exactly what's going on, exactly where the disconnect is. So let me jump into my screen here. If anybody has questions along the way, please do post in the comments, and I will try and address that later on towards the end of this this video. But let's look at a very simple example. So I've got a staccato here, and I've got a note that is marked with consordino, right? And this expression map right now basically doesn't have either in it. So if I look at my expression map for this, we can see that I actually just have, this is the very basic default, right? Now, you don't necessarily actually have to have any correct trigger values. You just have to have the either base switches or add-ons set up in here in order for your expression map to start sort of recognizing and resolving these different values. But let's take a look and see what's happening for staccato. So I'm going to mouse over this. So again, just in case people aren't sure how I got to this interface, I'm in the play or in the write mode up here. So I go to write mode, and then you open up this lower zone here. Lower zone is terminology from Cubase. You go ahead and you open up the key editor, make sure that's open, and then you can see this MIDI key editor. And down here at the bottom is this lovely playing techniques lane, which is also now part of the Cubase score editor. Thank goodness, because it is just a real delight. Makes this kind of troubleshooting so much easier. So what's happening here is that the notes are being broken up into segments on our playing techniques lane based on how Dorico is resolving the specific playback for each of those notes. So here, if we mouse over this, we can see that it says base switch is natural, internal effects are staccato, and active techniques are staccato. But what does that really mean? So that's one of the things that I wanted to engage in. Over here, I've got a little list of them. So base switch. The base switch essentially is what has been resolved. What has Dorico resolved to play in your expression map? So here, that's showing up as natural because it's the only thing in our expression map, and it's going to be the most common sort of fallback that Dorico will always fall back to if it can't find something else, right? So as long as you have a natural actually configured in your expression map, then you'll pretty much always get sound. Of course, you're not going to get staccato and you're not going to get consordino, but you're going to get a sound. And so the base switch, that first value in the tooltip, that sort of flyover window, is telling you which of the playback techniques in your expression map Dorico has actually resolved to play for that note. Then in the second, let me mouse over it again. The second value here, internal effects. Now you'll notice there's an internal effects for the staccato note, but there is not an internal effect. I guess I have to come over here to see this. You'll see that there is no internal effect here. And why does the consordino not have an internal effect? Well, the internal effect is essentially what Dorico is registering from your playback options or playback overrides from the expression map. These are things like when you go into the playback options, for example, you can set the playback length of the duration of staccato versus staccatissimo, or the intensity of accents and marcatos. And I'll show you what that looks like, because you've probably seen these. And this is saying we recognize that there are actually effects in place. These are modifications that are being made typically to the duration or intensity of your note by settings that are correlated to this particular articulation, in this case staccato. So if I hold Command Shift and I go to P for playback and I come down here to timing, you can see that there's a timing for staccato notes right here. That staccato notes will have their written duration or their played back duration will be half of their written duration. And you can also see that, for example, if we were to enable this little button right here, played durations, you can actually see then the difference. So if I don't enable that, it looks like this staccato note takes up an entire eighth note, but when this is enabled and we see both the playback and the notated duration, which is indicated by the bottom line, we can see that it's actually being cut in half. And that's maybe desirable. It's a way of making sure that the staccato note plays back a very tight, punchy note, right? But that's why this has an internal effect of staccato. It's saying, hey, we have settings in the playback options or playback overrides in the expression map that are affecting the playback of this note. So that's what the internal effects refers to. And then active techniques. Active techniques is essentially other things that Dorico is aware of, anything Dorico has recognized about the note. And this brings us back full circle to the original problem that I think a lot of people, I certainly have faced this. At this point, I've done so much with expression maps that this is the mechanism I use to trace back and usually solve the problems relatively quickly. But everybody has had this experience where they've notated their score correctly. They're sure that they've put the right playback techniques in their expression map, and still it's not playing back. Well, the thing to do is to come here and look at what the active techniques are and what the base switch is, because essentially the active technique is probably what's missing from your expression map. So if I were to look, for example, at this consordino note up here, right, this quarter note that has consordino applied to it, and I have maybe a consordino playback technique loaded in my, let's go and actually do this. I'll show you that because it's kind of crazy making. It's not going to connect up unless it's absolutely precise. So let me go into expression maps, right? And I don't even know if I have a consordino. I don't even have a consordino. But this is the kind of thing that might happen where someone has created let me go up here very, very quickly. Let's say that we set a playback technique and we just create a new one and we call it consordino, right? And we do direction. It doesn't really matter for this example. Now we have a playback technique. I can go into my expression map and I can add consordino right there. Now it shows up because this is a list of playback techniques. As you can see, playback techniques, not playing techniques. It doesn't matter if it's a playing technique. It only matters if playing techniques are what you can put in your score, but your expression map can recognize any playback technique. So let's say I've got this consordino in here, right? But wait a minute, my consordino note is still turning up as natural. And, you know, this is the point at which most people start pulling out their hair. And it's really frustrating. The reason why, I'm going to just go ahead and put another staccato on there so that I can easily mouse over this. The reason is that this is not looking for an active technique of consordino. This is looking for an active technique of muted. So until I have muted in my expression map, it's not going to work. So let's see what happens now. If this one's looking for staccato, there's no staccato in my expression map, so it's reverted to resolving back to base switch. This one, it doesn't have, I can't find muted either. So again, it's reverted to the natural. So if we go into the expression map and we add the two that we see as active techniques, if we go here and I add in muted, right? So this is muted. It's not what I called consordino, but this is the one that it's looking for based on the playing technique that I applied in my score. Now if I put in muted, lo and behold, we're going to find that the muted gets, well, it's still looking actually for the active technique. I was being a little too quick there. If I were to go ahead and actually change this to natural, and muted, I believe. Now that is not working, and I'm looking a bit sheepish here because I got I got confused of my own. Oh, you know what it is? It's that it's not that. It's that I'm applying the default expression map. Here you go, everybody. Everyone makes mistakes. So pipeline demo, that's what I need. And once I have that, I don't want to have that be natural and muted. I just want it to be muted. Now we see the consordino is being properly mapped to muted because that was the active technique it was looking for. That was the technique that it recognized, and it was looking for the base switch of muted, and it was not finding one, so it was reverting to natural. Now staccato, we still have none there. So if we go in here to the library, to expression maps, I'm sorry, I forgot that I'm not showing you my screen. Now if I come in here and I were to add a base switch for staccato, okay, again, it doesn't matter that I'm not actually configuring these. As long as they exist, we can do a demonstration about how these get resolved. So now we can see that the staccato note is getting resolved as staccato because we do actually have the active technique in our expression map. And muted, which is actually the active technique behind consordino the way I implemented it here, now that it's in our expression map, we can find that. So let me just also touch base quickly on the reason that consordino is showing up in my score, but the articulation or playback technique that it's looking for is actually muted. Let me get into a little bit of why that is, just in case there are folks out there who aren't clear. So playing techniques are things that are in your score. Playback techniques are things that are in your expression map. And when you go to playing techniques and we look up consordino, like this, what we find is that down here it's connected to this muted playback technique, right? So let's just take a crazy example, and let's say that we were to connect this consordino to this delay playback technique, right? Now what's happening is that, let me go back in here, consordino. So now you can see that the active technique now is actually delay, not muted anymore, right? It's being recognized as muted, but actually I would need to put a delay playback technique. I'm not sure what kind of playback technique that is, but I would need to put that in my expression map. So I'd actually have to come in here and I would have to put in delay. Like that. Now I picked delay here not because it's realistic, but because it's so far out of the norm. Now you can see it has tracked that down. So the active technique is what Dorico is looking for. The internal effects means that Dorico has other settings, usually in the playback options or in overrides, playback overrides, which you can find in individual expression maps, and that those are changing the note's duration, like we saw with staccato, or the intensity, as is the case with accents, for example. If we were to let me just look at that quickly. If we went back into playback options, and up here we looked at dynamics, and we scrolled down, we can find that the accents and marcatos, for example, these are actually increased. They have their dynamic increased by a certain amount automatically just because they've been marked with accents or marcatos. And those are internal effects. Those are things from the settings that are going to be applied to the note playback. And that's what's being shown in that little tooltip. But the thing you really, really want to look at when you are trying to troubleshoot why your expression map isn't playing back the right technique, even though you're sure you've set it up right, is to look at that active technique and the base switch. The base switch is what it's resolved to playing, and the active technique is what it's recognized, what it's looking for. So you can just go into your expression map basically and make sure that you have got that active technique registered in your expression map, and then it'll give you an avenue to making sure it's triggering exactly the right sound. So I hope that that is offering a good insight and help to anybody who's been pulling their hair out a whole lot. I just want to take a look at the comments here. Thank you for pointing that out, Michael. So Michael is saying that in Dorico 6, some of the playback information is being cached, which is probably a performance gain in some sense, but also can lead to temporarily maybe some of those values being a little bit misrepresented. So that's just something to be aware of. So the solution there is, I guess, to close and reopen. Awesome. So yeah, it's good to hear, Shubhas, that you've used this tool before. I think this popover is probably the most transparent tool that Dorico really gives us, and it sort of flies under the radar there because you got to go into the key editor, you got to mouse over it, and it kind of disappears. I use it all the time once I understood what it was for. And the whole purpose here is to make sure that we have ways to backtrack what Dorico thinks that it should play back versus what it is playing back, and making sure that that active technique and that base switch, those two values are kind of synced up. And if you're not getting the playback, just make sure you've got an example of the active techniques. And sometimes you'll see that active technique as, a combined thing where you have, like staccato and consordino, staccato plus consordino or something like that. In which case, you want to make sure that that combination is actually available in your expression map, and then all your problems go away and everything plays back just the way you want. So that's where I'm going to leave it for now. I appreciate that we had some people on the call today. And if you have questions, do please post in the comments. If you are watching this after the fact and you're new to my channel, please do like and subscribe if you found this video helpful. And I am working on a larger project around developing some information I think would be useful for composers across multiple libraries. So I'd really appreciate it if you'd actually comment on this video and tell me which libraries you use the most. I'm really curious. If I were to target some attention on a few libraries, my sense for my own use is CSS and Berlin. But if there are other libraries everybody's really using heavily and having great experience with, please let me know in the comments, because I am working on a larger project to try to illuminate some ways to work in Dorico with libraries that I think represent what everybody who uses the channel is actually using. So please post that. Without any further ado, I'm going to wrap it up for today. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Well, actually, no, it's Tuesday. I'm sorry. I'll see you on Thursday then. I hope everybody has a good week. Until Thursday, I'll see you next time. All right, bye.